Hi, we're presenting on the Cold War. I'm Alex.
I'm Brooke.
Okay.
I'm Walker.
Okay, so what was the Cold War? The Soviet Union and the United States fought as allies against Nazi Germany during World War II. After World War II, there was a state of geopolitical tension between the Eastern and Western blocs. The Western bloc consisted of the United States, its NATO allies, and others, and the Eastern bloc consisted of the Soviet Union and its satellite states. It's called the Cold War because there was no actual large-scale fighting directly between the two sides. Although they both did support proxy wars, which are regional wars, there was no actual fighting between the two. The Soviet Union tightened its grip on Eastern Europe, and the United States started a journey on containment to prevent the spread of Soviets and communism on the Western Europeans. During 1947, the Truman Doctrine was created to pledge aid to governments threatened by communism, and the Marshall Plan provided billions of dollars in economic assistance to eliminate political instability. So Kennedy and the Cold War. The Cold War dominated the 1960 election. Both the senator and the vice president pledged to strengthen the American military forces and promised the American people a tough stance against the Soviet Union and against communism. John F. Kennedy was the first American president born in the 20th century. Two of the biggest accomplishments during his presidency were the Cold War and the nuclear arms race, which will be explained later. He pledged that the American people wouldn't pay any price, bear any burden, meet any hardship, support any friend, oppose any foe to assure the survival and success of liberty. Okay, the Bay of the Pigs. Before his inauguration, John F. Kennedy was briefed on a plan during the Eisenhower administration to train Cuban exiles for an invasion of their homeland. The plan anticipated that there would be support from the Cuban people as well as the Cuban military, and this would lead to an overthrow of Castro. Kennedy approved his operation, and 1,400 exiles landed at Cuba's Bay of Pigs on April 17th. All the exiles were either captured or killed, and Kennedy took full responsibility of the failed operation. So the arms race. What was the arms race? It denotes a rapid increase in the quality and quantity of instruments of military power starting in the 1940s. The arms race was a characteristic of the Cold War between the US and the Soviet Union, although the weapons had changed to nuclear weapons. Part of the arms race included the building of the Berlin Wall to stop the flood of Eastern Germans into Western Germany. Because of the threatening developments from the Soviet leader Khrushchev, Kennedy ordered substantial increase in American missile forces. Kennedy also resumed American nuclear testing in early 1962 as the Soviets continued to test and build their nuclear forces.
So now we're going to talk about NATO. The question would be, what is NATO? NATO stands for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It was founded in 1949. It was a group of 29 countries from Europe and North America. The alliance is founded on the principle of collective defense, meaning that if one NATO ally is attacked, then all NATO allies are attacked. For example, when terrorists attacked the United States on 9/11, all NATO allies stood with America as though they had also been attacked. 10 things to know about NATO is they're also a collective defensive. They manage crisis, fighting terrorism, and cyber defense. Something important to know about NATO is that it's different than the United Nations, and it still stands today, which you'll see in the next slide. It's different than the Warsaw Pact. So now we'll talk about the Warsaw Pact. The Warsaw Pact was pretty much the opposite of NATO. It was pretty much Soviet Russia's version of it, and it consisted of all of its vassals and allies and satellite states, mostly Eastern European nations, specifically East Berlin as well. It was disbanded in 1990 when the Berlin Wall fell.
Now we're going to talk about the kitchen debate in 1959. Vice President Richard Nixon and Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev engaged in a complex debate during the opening of the American National Exhibition in Moscow. The United States and Soviet Union agreed to both set up national exhibitions in both countries. New York City opened the Soviet Union exhibition, and in Sokolniki Park in Moscow opened the U.S. exhibition. Nixon flew over before the opening in Moscow to give Khrushchev a tour of the exhibit. The whole goal for this cultural exchange program was to understand and show the difference in culture of both countries. As Nixon was showing Khrushchev the American standard of living, Khrushchev began to get heated. While showing the Soviet leader the technology display, he proclaimed that they will have that sort of appliances in the near future. Nixon came back to say that the Soviet leader doesn't know everything and he shouldn't be shy on new ideas. This leads Khrushchev to snap and say that Nixon only fears communism. Turning into a debate about capitalism versus communism, the kitchen debate wound up being one of the most well-known engagements of the Cold War.
The pictures of these can also be shown to the left of the actual kitchen debate.
Nixon versus Khrushchev. The two started out just being bantering back and forth as they stand in front of the kitchen in the American exhibit, which is shown on the right with the bars. Nixon starts talking about the new appliances in the kitchen to help make life easier for women. Khrushchev points out to Nixon that communism does not have the same views as capitalism when it comes to women. Nixon disagrees and comes back saying he thinks his view of women is universal. Nixon moves on from the subject and explains Khrushchev how most Americans and steel workers can afford a house around $10,000 to $15,000. Khrushchev comes back to say that their workers can afford the same price of houses, but their houses are built to last longer and are stronger than American houses. Nixon fights this opinion by saying that Americans just grow tired of their home or want new appliances. There's no fact that they don't last less than 20 years. But of course, the Soviet leader comes back to debate on this. The conversation gets a bit more heated up when Khrushchev starts talking about how America views the Soviet Union. Khrushchev believes that Americans think Russians don't have these equipment in their homes, but the newly built homes have all these appliances. He also mentions you are entitled to a house when born in the Soviet Union, but in America, you get two options when you don't have money. Bringing up that Nixon says they're slaves to communism, Nixon finally gets his voice, his opinion after all the Soviet leader had to say, and calls the Senate a filibuster. The Soviet leader doesn't let anyone but himself talk. The whole point for this exhibit was to interest people the difference, not to compete. There is a difference politically between the two countries, but Nixon believed that doesn't mean that they can't get along and learn from one another. America's reaction on the kitchen debate. On July 25th, the kitchen debate was televised in the U.S. Moscow broadcasted the debate as well, but a few days later. As discussed between Nixon and Khrushchev, the broadcast of the debate was supposed to run simultaneously in both countries, but the Soviets protested and held the tape. It was 2 days later, Moscow broadcasted the debate, but with a twist, that ran it late at night and translated only partially Nixon's comments. When broadcasted in America, people had mixed reactions. In the New York Times, they wrote an exchange that emphasized the gulf between East and West, but had little bearing on the substantive issue. They also mentioned how Nixon handled the debate fairly well. Nixon had gained popularity from the public after the cultural exchange. This increased his odds when running for the Republican presidential nomination.
So now we're going to talk about communism. In a basic, communism is the idea that everyone is economically equal without classes and states. Pretty much the opposite is America, whereas there's no gap between the poor and the rich. Everybody pretty much makes the same money. In Soviet Russia, the government was primarily a communist form of government, although it was considered fascist. All their people pretty much made the same money, which earlier you heard in the kitchen debate. A steel worker could afford the same house as a doctor in their country, whereas in America, that wouldn't be the case. It was based off a Marx idea, and it came from socialism. Communism would just be the extreme version of it. And then we have capitalism. Capitalism was seen all around the world, and it wasn't invented by America, but it was adopted by it. And it's a form of government where freedom is a dominant idea, freedom of rights, freedom of property, and free market. Nixon argued that capitalism was much more effective than communism by saying that everyone had opportunity to get a variety of household products by working, and are able to renew products and buy new houses, which is opposite from Russia. They said they didn't have to because they created everything that would last, which isn't true. But private ownership is one big thing, or one big idea in capitalism, meaning you can own your own property, you can have private property, you can own private whatever you want, pretty much. And it came from the idea of laissez-faire, which is pretty much, it promotes a free economy, which people can rise and low, and there can be barons and stuff like that.
Okay, so Reagan and the Cold War. Ronald Reagan claimed the prevailing policies of containment and détente, or peace, would not bring a satisfactory end to the Cold War. He strongly disliked détente, and he would say, "So far, détente's been a one-way street that the Soviet Union has used to pursue its own aims. The goal must be the promotion of world revolution and a one-world communist or socialist state." According to President Reagan, the Soviets considered détente a sign of American weakness and vulnerability. He instead wanted peace through strength by building America's economic and military power. President Reagan intended not merely to contain Soviet communism, but to reverse its gain and subdue it. He suspected the Soviet Union was not as strong as it appeared to be. So the Berlin Wall falling. On November 9th, 1989, as the Cold War was beginning to thaw out across Eastern Europe, the spokesman for East Berlin's Communist Party announced a change in his city's relation with the West. Starting that same day, he said that the citizens of the GDR were free to cross the country's borders. More than 2 million people from East Berlin visited West Berlin to participate in celebration. East and West Berliners flocked to the wall, drinking beer and champagne and chanting, "Open the gate." And at midnight, they flooded through the checkpoints. As soon as the wall was gone, Berlin was gone, and Berlin was united. As soon as the wall was gone, Berlin was united for the first time since 1945. Reunification of East and West Germany was made official on October 3rd, 1990, almost 1 year after the fall of Berlin Wall. Vietnam and the Korean War. The United States was against communism, and the U.S. fought 2 wars against communists. These were the Vietnam and the Korean Wars. The Korean War started in June 1950 and ended in March 1953. At the time, Korea was a divided country. The communists were in the north and the non-communists were in the south. The United States tried to help unite the country. At the end of the war, there were no real winners, and the country was and is still divided into 2. The Vietnam War was from 1964 to 1973. Vietnam was also a divided country similar to Korea, and there were communists and non-communists. The United States wanted to help unite Vietnam and not have a communist government. It was a very long war, and many deaths were involved. The war divided many areas of the U.S. because some Americans didn't agree with the fight against Vietnam. The Cold War continued until 1990, and it was at this time that the Soviet Union began to break apart. The Cold War was over, and the United States and the former Soviet Union became allies.
The outcome of the Cold War. When the Cold War was over in 1990, the nuclear arms race between the United States and the USSR came to an end, and both countries significantly reduced their nuclear weapons. The Soviet Union dissolved into 15 independent countries, and the satellite states in Eastern Europe overthrew their pro-Soviet governments and became independent. The United States of America became the most powerful country in the world, with the Soviet Union now out of the way. The outcome of the war was led to prove that capitalism flourished while communism failed. You could argue that and see that Cuba still survived in communism, even though their economy is failing even to this day. But the outcome of the Cold War basically led to what we see now, with the creation of many nations united. Russia is now free; you can go into it, and yeah, that's the Cold War.
The end.